Mhm. Okay, so we are currently live on Google Hangouts and going directly to YouTube. And this is an Earth in Brackets Presents webinar towards the Paris COP21, the UN climate talks. I'm Nathan Thankey. I am the Global North focal point for the youth constituency, which is called Youngo. And I'm going to facilitate this call, which was kindly put together by our colleagues at the youth group Earth in Brackets, based in the US at College of the Atlantic. And Sergio, who is also online, is supporting us with the technical element to this. So I have a very great pleasure today in introducing Chee Yoke Ling from Third World Network, the director of Third World Network, who is going to present a very difficult subject in a relatively short amount of time. She is going to undertake the challenge to summarize and in a way analyze 25 years of negotiating history in about 25 minutes. So we'll hear from Yoke Ling. We will take questions via the Q&A function of Google Hangouts at the end, or I suppose you could tweet at Earth in Brackets with your questions, and Sergio can help me, and I'll moderate. I will also monitor those. But yeah, it is a great privilege to have Yoke Ling. She has a wealth of knowledge on the subject. Someone who has followed it closely from an inside angle for a number of years, and one of the most holistic and complete sort of understandings that of anyone I know. But also, in a way, she is able to express those and summarize those to people that don't have such a sort of vast experience in it, which I think others of her peers somewhat lack at times. So without sort of any further ado, Yoke Ling, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you very much for doing this. It's going to be a great help to a lot of young people who are coming to this for the first, second, third, or even fourth or fifth time.
Thank you very much, Nathan, and thank you, Sergio, for helping us to navigate this technically. I guess most of you who are going to be, involved in this discussion in the next hour or so were not even born when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was born. So I was asked to sort of give a context, sort of in terms of this very important international treaty of the United Nations. What are some of the reasons behind why we had the world community come together? Over a period of maybe 2 to 3 years, culminating in 1992, when after very, very difficult negotiations, we did have an adoption of a very historic, legally binding treaty. And this is the first point I want to make, that the climate treaty, the UNFCCC, is a legally binding United Nations treaty. And it has almost universal membership. Even the United States actually signed on to the treaty. And this is important to remember because in the last 10 years or so, we keep hearing about how, especially after the Copenhagen 2009 annual climate meeting of the governments, that there has been a failure. We have spent 20 years negotiating and we still don't have an agreement. And that is absolutely not true. We started off with having an agreement that was negotiated, like I said, over 2 to 3 years. And it was the first international intergovernmental panel on climate change, IPCC report, that affirmed, from the science point of view, there is a link between human activity based on the fossil fuel economy that has caused over 150 years of industrialization, the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that accumulation has triggered temperature rise, which triggers climate change and extreme climate events. So that is a recognized scientific fact, even though there was still a debate over how many percent of the scientific community, between 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, believes in it or not, based on science. So when we talk about the treaty, a legally binding instrument or agreement, we already have it. So we have spent the last more than 20 years, since 1992, making sure that we will implement this UNFCCC to be able to do what? And this is important to, then I want every one of you, if you have not already done so, to go and download the UNFCCC and read that document. It is a very readable document. if you look at the document, it says very clearly in what we call the preamble, the background, the introduction to the sort of obligations and commitments. It says very clearly, and this was agreed, remember, by all these governments who got together, the industrialized countries, the developing countries, the LDCs, more than 20 years ago. And this is a very fundamental agreement, that the largest share of historical and current, at that time, global emissions of greenhouse gases originated in developed countries. And that the per capita emissions in developing countries are still low, and that the share of global emissions originating in developing countries will still need to grow because we need to build a society that overcomes poverty and to meet social and developmental needs. This is a very important principle that is the foundation of this treaty. And recognizing the historical emissions, the overconsumption, as we will say today, of the carbon budget, therefore, a very important principle that became international law in this treaty is that the basis of the sets of obligations and responsibilities and commitments of all countries, developed and developing, is based on equity and common but differentiated responsibilities. That the climate change is happening, the planet's stability is affected, we all have a common responsibility but differentiated because of this historical fact. And that global warming is the result of the accumulation. So when this is a very important basic principle from the science point of view, translated to law, which we have to understand, because today when we hear a lot of statements like the world has changed since 1992, the biggest emitter in absolute terms today is China, then we must ask ourselves, history does not start with 2005, 2010, or even 2015 in Paris. It starts from 150 years ago when industrialization based on fossil fuels started. And this is very important because the basis for the obligations, who should do more than the others, is on this historical responsibility fact. And then, based on the fact that a whole bunch of countries, what we call the OECD today, became wealthy using the carbon space, using fossil fuels, wealthy ability to have technology, to have the finance to actually deal with climate change. Therefore, there is an ecological debt owed to those countries that had no responsibility to cause the accumulation of greenhouse gases, but today are facing more impact just because they're located in those geographical areas, small islands, more vulnerable systems in the mountains, desert areas, or because their people are still poor and have no capacity to respond to extreme events. And so we now have this situation where the world really has more impacts that we are facing, but we still have not really implemented what we recognized needed to be done in 1992, that we need to have massive change in the way we do development, and that the objective of the treaty is very clear. We have to stabilize the greenhouse gas emissions to the point that we can actually have a stable climate system. The science tells us 1.5 degrees. Okay, 2 is the political agreement that we have. What we're doing today, we're exceeding already 2 degrees unless we do something really, really dramatic. And this stabilization is important. Why? And it is in the objective, Article 3 of the Convention. Please look at it. Stabilize so that we can have sustainable production of food, so that we can overcome poverty and deal with all the challenges. Because today we can say China is not the China of 1992. No country should be what it is in 1992. They're either worse or they're better off. And if they're better off in some respects, economic growth, new wealth. But if you look at China, and I live in Beijing, okay, we still, on one hand, we say, yes, this economic growth has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But we still have more than 100 million of people living in China who are living below the poverty line. Per capita emissions is still, for 1.4 billion people, much lower than the OECD average. Yes, every country must do more, and all of us in our countries are always demanding and continue to demand, and that's the right thing to do, that our countries should do more. But we are facing a planetary crisis, and we are facing a crisis not just about environment. The environmental crisis is the result of bad economics, bad use of energy sources. And so to change, to stabilize, and to meet the objectives of the Climate Convention, we need to actually change the paradigm of development. And let's not forget, this was actually recognized back in 1992. Because the climate treaty is not, the UNFCCC does not exist in a vacuum. It's part of the whole Agenda 21, many people forgot about this agenda for the 21st century, that says we must change the paradigm of development. Consumption and production must change. Developing countries must take the lead. Developed countries must take the lead. And developed countries taking the lead is also found in the UNFCCC provisions. And this is very important. So I want to just reiterate historical responsibility, ability to actually take more action, the need to change consumption and production in the north, and for developing countries in the south, they also have obligations and huge commitments under the Climate Convention to change the path of development towards a more sustainable pathway. And that would have meant also the other parts of the agreement back in 1992, we must have really significant, massive transfers of finance and the right technologies so that developing countries do not follow the same fossil fuel pathway. That was the deal enshrined in a legally binding agreement back in 1992. There has been a failure of implementation. The money is not about development aid, it's not about charity, it is about a historical debt to the developing countries and its peoples. Because when the money comes, if the money comes, we must also make sure in every one of our countries that that money, that resource, those technologies are the ones that are best serving the people and the planet. So we are also in all our countries, when we do have resources coming in the developing south, that this must also be used for sustainability. So when we hear statements like, oh, you know, the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change is out of date. No, go and look at it again. It is as relevant today as it was 20 years ago. And its failure is the failure of implementation. So what we found, of course, if we move fast forward to 2000, and I would not say Copenhagen. It's not about Copenhagen in 2009. In 2007, in the annual meeting of the parties of the convention in Bali, we had a very interesting thing happen there. Now, the United States, for me, remains the single biggest problem. The single biggest problem. The senior Bush administration, by some freak of history, actually signed on to the UNFCCC, something that we would not be able to see any Congress today in the United States agreeing to signing on to such an agreement. Why? Because I think at that time, this is my personal opinion, and I think a lot of people have analyzed this, that at that time in the early 90s, there was this really overwhelming moment where we recognized that global warming is a real thing. Biodiversity was being decimated at a very, very amazing speed. So we had all these amazing conventions on biodiversity, on climate change that came out of the UN. The UN was the place where we could all come together, small and big, and say this is a common challenge and crisis. We got to work together. Now the United States could not do one thing. They could not agree, because one of the most important things that the convention recognizes is we have to cap emissions. We have to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. And the lead, as agreed by all countries in those days, because of historical responsibility, must be taken by the industrialized countries. But the United States could not agree to a number in the UNFCCC. So the number of what we will cut in terms of emissions was deferred to a next stage, and in a separate treaty under the convention to set the targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that is what the Kyoto Protocol is about. The Kyoto Protocol is to implement the obligation of developed countries, industrialized world, to cut emissions of greenhouse gases. The science said we should be cutting by more than 20–30%. Politically, all we could get in the Kyoto Protocol for the first period of 5 years to be implemented between 2008 and 2012 was an average of 5% reduction based on 1990 levels of the developed countries. I loosely call them the developed countries, but in the treaty it's called the Annex 1 countries. And these include the Soviet Union, and then later on, of course, Russia and the former Soviet Union states. Again, the basis of that Annex 1 to cut emissions under international law is because of their historical responsibility. So by 2012, we find that countries like Japan and Canada and Australia could not even make the mark of their share of the 5%. The 5% divided among the Annex 1 countries is also based on equity. Those who can do more should do more. So the United States have a bigger share than a smaller country, from Europe, for example. But as we crept towards 2012, when we got to 2007, 2008, 2009, those countries already realized that, oh, maybe we can't do it. Politically, we can't. To change those things in the industrial north, we must crack down on corporations, we must crack down on consumption, we must crack down on fossil fuels, and they were not prepared to do that politically. And so we saw the movement, even before the Kyoto Protocol first commitment period, as we call the reduction period, come into being, there was already an attempt to rewrite the rules. And the United States, for example, the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities that the rich countries should take the lead was something that already many parts of Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, the US, they were already not happy with it. So in 2007, at the annual meeting of the parties to the convention, there was already an attempt to sort of say that, well, we have to get these big developing countries like China and India and Brazil and all this, South Africa, middle-income countries like mine, Malaysia, that these countries must also have legally binding commitments to reduce the emissions. Like I said, for these countries in the South, including even China, or in India especially, the poverty is still very, very prevalent. The quality of life is still far from what we would say has dignity, and therefore they will need to still develop in a sustainable manner. In the transition, we cannot overnight not use coal. A country like China or India is more than 60–70% dependent on coal. How do you switch? How do you switch from that dependency to renewables? The scale of the transformation is so enormous that even if he puts every last dollar on it, it will not be enough. And that is why the convention says there must be a transfer of resources in terms of finance and the best technology available at affordable prices for us to do that transformation. It didn't happen. In Bali, there was an attempt to rewrite the rules. Developing countries with a lot of civil society support, and I would say the role of civil society, youth groups, environmentalists, development groups, trade unions, farmers came together and said, wait a minute, if you want to change the rules, it means ultimately, what does it mean for agriculture? What does it mean for public transport? What does it mean for everything that has to do with development? Because it all is linked to emissions and energy policies and climate change. So in 2007, developing countries stood up, worked with all the other developed countries, and isolated the United States. Okay, 2007, why is it significant? Because in 2008, the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol to cut that 5% across all the Annex 1 countries was going to kick in, 2008. 2007, the United States was trying to change the rules. And so that moment, Europe especially, worked with developing countries, and all the other developed countries worked together and isolated the United States, so that the US was obviously not going to be a party to the Kyoto Protocol. They resisted a number for reducing emissions in the convention, if you remember that. Then we negotiated the Kyoto Protocol. The US then tried to put in all these mechanisms of emissions trading so that you don't do the emissions cuts in your country in the north, but we try to buy credits from the developing countries. So these market mechanisms of international trading, offsetting, things that we are fighting, many of us are fighting, including yourselves, was put into the Kyoto Protocol because we wanted to get the United States on board. But even then, when we put its loopholes, its great loopholes into the Kyoto Protocol, the United States still could not agree to that. No way could they do that in Congress. So we see a pattern in the US. First of all, if you don't like something, you object. Secondly, if you cannot object to its existence and its birth, you try to dilute it. And then when you go in there and it's diluted, you still walk away. And then the world is left holding really more and more crisis. So in 2007 in Bali, it was very significant because the whole world gathered together and said, fine, if the United States cannot join the Kyoto Protocol and see the first commitment period kick into action, then you still have an obligation under the UNFCCC, the Mother Convention, to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. It's a legal obligation of the United States. No numbers, but it's a legal obligation. So we have this very important decision from Bali that says that those countries that are not a party to the to the Kyoto Protocol, but is within that list of Annex 1, you must do comparable reduction of your emissions. And the United States was forced to agree to that decision. But to get the United States to agree to that, to do what they're supposed to do anyway, all right? And we're telling them, you set your targets. We're not even asking you to follow the Kyoto Protocol. The trade-off was that developing countries would agree to do mitigation actions, something that they're not required to do under the convention. They're supposed to change the path of development, very, very difficult, to go into sustainable development, forego using coal and all these fossil fuels with help from the international community. But to get the United States to agree to that whole package, that they will still do what they have to do under the convention, developing countries agreed to do voluntary national mitigation actions. So this is one step addition to what developing countries actually need to do. But they say fine, because countries like China and Brazil and South Africa and other middle income countries realize that we also must play our role. But we cannot take on this legally binding, cuts. But we will do mitigation actions based again on the convention agreement that we will get support. To do more, we must get support from outside, from the developed world, on finance and technology. So Bali became very important because it had these two tracks that we must have the Kyoto Protocol really become meaningful, and those outside the Kyoto Protocol, which is the United States predominantly, nothing still was really being done. And then we have 2009 in Copenhagen. And this is where the whole idea of a new agreement or an agreement on climate change came up. There was so much hype. And this is where there was a lot of misleading information out there. The mainstream media, and I do believe this was a lot of spinning by the European Union, certain factions of the European Union, the United States, the climate skeptics. Everybody was saying, well, skeptics don't want anything. They don't believe climate change is happening. But for a lot of the people who did not want to have that equitable sharing of actions under the convention, wanted to rewrite the rules. And this was very much led by the Obama administration. If you all remember, some of you may have been there, Copenhagen was such a violation of the rules of respect and decision-making in the United Nations. Heads of states came together. There was a whole build-up that we're going to have a climate agreement, as if we don't have any climate agreements. And this is very, very important to remember. Copenhagen created, or the road to Copenhagen over a year, created this impression we had nothing in the world, and we need a climate agreement. And I think this is what I see the difference today compared to Copenhagen, is that people like yourselves, using brackets and all that, you were set up basically to just share and deepen the knowledge and information among young people, because a lot of young people were also taken for a ride in the road to Copenhagen. That we need an agreement because there's nothing in the world. It's been a failure. No, we spent more than 20 years struggling to implement our mother convention called the UNFCCC. In Bali, the decision was to enhance the implementation of the UNFCCC. Two parts. One, the protocol itself, and all the obligations of developed and developing countries in the mother convention. So then Copenhagen was a disaster from some points of view, but for many of us it was not a disaster. Why? Because enough people stood up, enough small and other middle income countries stood up to tell the United States and Europe, we will not allow you to mutate the rules of the UN decision making. Heads of states, prime ministers, presidents were all in the corridor with you and me, some of us who were there, while a few handpicked heads of states, handpicked by Obama basically, and his aides, were in, and the Danish prime minister who wanted to have a success in Copenhagen. They went off to a room. They just everybody else was waiting. Ban Ki-moon was waiting. Other prime ministers were waiting, and they clobbered this thing called the Copenhagen Agreement. But that agreement was never accepted. Never accepted the so-called Copenhagen Accord. It was taken note of by the Conference of Parties at the final session at 5 in the morning, 2 days beyond when it was supposed to be ending, but it was never adopted. So we have been struggling every year since then to do the right thing. But I would say, just to get into our discussion as quickly as possible, that ever since then, developing countries have agreed to take on more and more in the hope that we will get the developed countries to honor their agreement and legal obligations that they undertook in 1992 under the Mother Convention. In 2012, the first period of the Kyoto Protocol cuts came to an end. Many countries did not meet their level of responsibility. We negotiated very, very hard to get a second commitment. The second commitment talks about reducing between 2013 and 2020 over an 8-year period, a reduction of 18% below 1990 levels. Nothing so insignificant compared to what the science tells us we must cut. And even this minuscule reduction up to 2020, between 2013 and 2020, was just unacceptable. Canada, we famously know, walked out entirely out of the Kyoto Protocol. Russian Federation, Japan say we're not going to even bother to sign up to the second commitment period. Today, the second commitment period has not entered into force because it has not enough number of countries that have actually accepted it. So it's dead. But developing countries said, we know it is a very weak second commitment period. We're willing to even accept that because we didn't get what we were asking for in terms of the real cuts. So we said, fine, we will accept it. Developing countries said, if we agree to two things. Again, this is again a sort of like a rebalancing of obligations. And this is in 2011 in Durban in South Africa. Developing countries said, we will accept a rather bad deal on the second commitment period on the understanding that there will be an attempt between 2011 to 2020 to ratchet up what the developed countries need to do under the Kyoto Protocol, because what you have agreed is not enough. Secondly, under tremendous pressure, developing countries agreed that we will have yet another new agreement to enhance the implementation of the Mother Convention. The United States, and by now the Europeans have decided that they will want to go with the United States because everybody feels that the Chinas and the Indias and the South Africa and the Brazil and other middle income countries should do more. That they should be also doing cuts. We should all be doing cuts together. And so this idea of historical responsibility is challenged. The idea that we have different sets of obligations based on equity is challenged. And so it is not just about wanting to negotiate better implementation. There's no interest in that. It is about really killing the Mother Convention. The change of fundamental rules of the game, to deny historical responsibility, and to say that history begins 2005, 2010, when some developing countries, because of economic growth, still based, unfortunately, on the fossil fuel economy, have begun to emit more and more greenhouse gases. And so we have reached today, going towards Paris, the idea that we are going to have another new agreement. And let's go back again and look at what was decided. In Durban in 2011, the decision was that we will have two tracks of negotiations under the so-called Durban platform. One, in the pre-2020 period, that we have to increase what the developed countries are supposed to do under the Kyoto Protocol and under the UNFCCC Mother Convention, the United States, which is not a Kyoto Protocol party, you have to really do much more in the pre-2020. In the post-2020 period, the so-called new agreement, another agreement that's supposed to come out by Paris, will see developing countries taking on even more responsibility, willing to do so, although under tremendous pressure. But what is this new thing we're supposed to have in Paris? The exact wording is that by 2015, we will have either a new protocol, another sort of sub-treaty, a child of the Mother Convention, or a legal instrument, international legal instrument, or some outcome with a legal binding force. Oh, those who are in the law studies and interested in law will say, well, this is very interesting nuance. For the layman, what's the difference? The difference is the degree of what we're prepared to accept and the degree of obligation that we'll be bound for. But whatever the formulation is, there was an agreement that it will have a legal force. And India was very clear, the Minister of Environment at that time, fought really, in the end, it was down to India and the United States. In that room, we all were watching. India insisted, supported by developing countries afterwards, it must be, whatever this new thing is, it must be under the convention, which means the principles of historical responsibility, equity, common and differentiated responsibilities. And that is what we're supposed to get out of Paris. And what is this all about? To enhance and to really invigorate the implementation of the Mother Convention. But what we have seen happening in the last few years is that the United States, even the EU, and certainly Australia, Canada, Japan, are pushing for dumping the Mother Convention, UNFCCC, and having an entire new agreement that is everybody does what they can do, whether you are a small island state or you're the United States. We'll do what we can do, bottom up. And so what we see now are these so-called INTCs, the intended nationally determined contributions. So we have already moved from a set of obligations and legal commitments to mitigate, to cut emissions of one group of countries. Another group of countries, developing countries, you have to transform your development path. And now everybody is treated the same. So this is what many of us have been calling for the last few years, the Great Escape. So for the OECD, industrialized countries, they are basically just walking away from the legal obligations. When Canada walked away, there was a little bit of media attention, but it's really gotten away with it with impunity. And so we see the balance of obligations and commitments to take action increasing for developing countries, poor and rich. Sometimes there is some concession to say, well, LDCs, least developed countries, is more island states. We give you some exceptions here and there, but we don't feel that it's good faith. whatever little exceptions, when it comes down to the crunch, it's about the few developed rich countries that want to just walk away from their responsibility. And so Paris is about a fight for equity, a fight for what the science tells us we have to do. We have to have deep cuts, and the way to deep cuts, the way to have environmental integrity and to have the deep cuts for stability of the climate is very linked to equity. If we don't have equity, we cannot get the ambition that we need to do the cuts. And without equity, we will condemn millions and millions of people to poverty so that the rich can continue their way of life. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Yoke Ling. That's kind of amazing, amazing how concise you can be with 25 years of history. So do we have any questions? And if you're watching this on Google Hangouts, you can activate the Q&A function. And if you're on Twitter or watching on YouTube, you can tweet at Earth in Brackets or at myself, N_Frankie, and we can relay the stuff. I see Sergio online. Do you have questions coming into you already, Sergio? Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. Let me look.
Either lost everybody or they're totally convinced.
They're reading the convention, Yoke Ling. As soon as you said that, they all went to the UNFCCC.int website and downloaded the convention and began reading it.
No, yeah, we don't have any questions yet.
Not yet? Okay. Let me just see. Maybe, Yoke Ling, you could speak a little bit to your expectations for Paris. And I know you've given the broad strokes version in terms of the great escape of responsibilities, but perhaps highlighting on what some of the really kind of key live issues are and what the range of options and opinions are, because it's often the case that we don't get the developing countries' perspectives on what the key issues are, so we understand the key issues to be what the Europeans and the Americans think are the key issues, because as you said, there's a strong sort of media bias.
Yeah. I think that the reason I actually sort of focus a lot on the idea of equity and historical responsibility is because if we walk away from that basic framework, a very relevant framework, because we keep hearing that the UNFCCC is out of date, it's not relevant for today's world, or worse, that a lot of people don't even know that there is a legal treaty already in place, yeah, and it is the lack of implementation, domestic actions in the developed world, in industrialized world, and the lack of the promise of the right kind of finance and technology to help developing countries go a different path for sustainable development, and not contribute to more global warming. So that fundamental sort of pact has been not honored. So one of the big things in Paris really is, and this is what we don't hear and see so much in the mainstream media, that there is this fundamental attempt to rewrite the convention. To throw into the dustbin and basically have something new come out of Paris that actually does not differentiate between those who have historical responsibility and those who have more capability and the capacity to actually do more. So I think that this is the fight that actually is very key as to what the Paris outcome will be. Now, if you look at the so-called text, we have a text, right, where different countries finally have been able to put different groups of countries, because developing countries are not negotiating as 140-something countries. They are together as a group of 77 in China, which is more than 150 countries, and the Africa group, the like-minded group, all these big groupings of countries have put on the table specific proposals that they want to get out of Paris, that is about how do we make the implementation of the Mother Convention really work in terms of the objectives, stabilizing climate, greenhouse gas emissions, ensuring food production is there, and just sustainable development. So that's what they want to do. So if we don't get, and at the same time we have the US and many of the other developed countries. Europe is a little bit in between, but more or less it's not that different anymore. Wanting to rewrite the rules because they're finding it difficult to do what needs to be done at home. So this is what I find the lack of honesty. So this fundamental rewriting of the rules is something we need to get out there between now and Paris and during Paris. And these rules which are rewritten means that if we don't have fairness and equity, we're not going to be able to do the actions. Now, one of the important things, and I think it will come a little bit in the other discussions on this series, I think Shivan is going to talk about this more in the tomorrow night. The civil society review, equity review, we had taken, and this is an amazing coming together of networks and organizations from very different perspectives and directions, but coming together on one common platform. That if we want to have really serious climate actions, it has to be based on good science and equity. So we took together more than 140 national INDCs or climate actions submitted now for the UNFCCC process. And so what this group did was to take all these national submissions from developed and developing countries, small and big, and look at the mitigation part of it. And then what do we find? And then we look at the carbon budget, what's left of the atmosphere, and most of it has been overused by the OECD countries. And looking at the carbon budget, what's left, how do you share fairly based on population, on historical responsibility, and then we measure each of these national actions for post-2020, right? Under the so-called new agreement that's going to come out of Paris, the agreement to further enhance implementing the UNFCCC. And we find, not surprisingly, but it was great to just see the actual data. The US, for example, what they are offering to do in the post-2020 period is 15% of what they should be doing. And then most developing countries have submitted rather ambitious plans, right? At home, each of our civil society groups and all that are fighting for our governments to even do more. But we pitch it against this fair share carbon budget, review that we have done in this civil society exercise. We find that most developing country submissions, they are doing more than their fair share. So we see very clearly what's happening in these submissions that will come out in Paris. It is not just a celebration, and this is what they think. There'll be a lot of celebration by the French government and many other governments to say, developed country governments, look, we have more than 150 countries, all offering to do, mitigation actions, developing and develop. This is great. But developing countries also insist we have adaptation, we have technology that we need, we have finance you haven't given us as you promised. All these things are part of the national actions that we want the international community to do. The developed countries are just celebrating the mitigation actions. But those mitigation actions will take us to above 2 degrees. It's not enough. And within that, the developed countries are doing far less than their share. So I really hope that this will come up more clearly, and this will be really important research and comparison that can be used by Earth in Brackets and the media and everybody, all right, to take that out. Secondly, I think that we will not get, we already hear many big NGOs, the UN Secretariat people are going around saying that we must now lower our expectations in Paris. We must not expect Paris to give us some big deal. Sorry, that's my phone. Hang on.
Okay, this is good.
Sorry about that. So what I think we will see in the short time coming up to Paris is a management to sort of like celebrate, I think, this more than 150 sort of national plans submitted, and to say also that now for the first time developing countries are agreeing to also do mitigation actions. I think that will be a sort of inaccurate messaging. I think we need to sort of say that what is fair and equitable and what is in the treaty is not being honored. I think that's something that we need to emphasize a lot. Now, the other thing that is very, very unfortunate what has happened in the last couple of days in terms of the tragedy that struck Paris. And I think we are all going to Paris with also a very mixed feeling. I think before 2 days ago, many of us saw going to Paris as a place to have a battleground over the issue of climate change, the issue of responsibility, the issue of equity, and the issue of really pointing out, as far as we can, who are the people who are which are the entities, which are the countries, which are the governments, not even countries, which are the governments and politicians that are not willing to do their part. And so what we need to do actually, and I think that will be a very difficult thing to do now, because I think there'll be a lot of pressure because of what's happened, this whole tragedy of the killings, that we do not want to see Paris be a failure. Right? There will be, I think, a lot of that kind of sensitivity around being more cooperative of an outcome in Paris. So I think the scenario that many of us see, even before this latest tragedy, is that there will be a sort of saying that we want some kind of declaration that might come up as a COP decision. Maybe some of the issues that need to be, which are unresolved, could go on after Paris, because Paris is not the end of everything. This is a convention that is alive and needs. There are many other decisions. Every COP, we only hear about something not being decided. No new agreement on getting developing countries to do more, kind of thing. But every COP decision, every COP meeting has so many decisions made on adaptation, on how to implement loss and damage, for example. We have a mechanism on loss and damage. We haven't even begun to implement it. There are many, many different aspects, many decisions which are very good decisions that actually need to be put into national action and into international action. So all that actually do not get attention. But I think out of Paris right now, for many of us, we are having a discussion. If we come up with a sort of an illusion that there is this huge, even though it's not major, earth-shaking, but that we have somehow come up with a very significant moment in climate change, I think that would not be the right deal to have, because I just don't see right now an outcome that would take us really to implement what we need to do to deal with this, this impending climate change crisis, because global warming is on a trajectory which is not optimistic. 2 degrees is actually now, it doesn't even look possible. It's going to be more. It's more than 2 degrees. And maybe what we need from Paris is honesty, that we in Paris have a whole bunch of national actions, but these actions are not enough. We have to reiterate that those who can do more have to do more. Historical responsibility cannot be wiped out. And that we will continue having to do the work after Paris. So we don't sort of describe Paris as failure or success, but that we have a lot of unfinished work and challenges that we need to meet.
Yeah. I'm seeing one question in the Q&A on Google Hangouts. It's from Nathan, who I believe is asking it from Canada. So he thanks you for your presentation, and it's a question about the long-term goal, or a long-term goal. So he says there's been a lot of talk about long-term goals, and the most concrete one has been a long-term goal for mitigation. He asks, what would you see are the other long-term goals? What other long-term goals do we require? And he suggests possibly one on adaptation.
Well, I think one of the very important goals and long-term goal is actually sustainable, predictable financing, right? Because finance is a very central part of what is needed to implement all the expectations under the 1992 Convention. And whatever agreement that comes out of Paris, even you look at this national INDCs, developing countries, most of them have put in what we will do domestically, but to do more, we will need international support. So finance and the right technology is what we call the means of implementation, is very central to the whole climate convention and what needs to be done. So we don't have a long-term goal, but we have at least a pledge of this $100 billion a year by 2020. What do we have now? We have in the Green Climate Fund a pledge of $9.2 billion over 5 years. And out of the $9.2 billion that was pledged, less than half of that had actually been approved by the countries that had pledged. So we are far from the target of that $100 billion per year. This is a political agreement, a pledge, all right, made a few years ago, that we should have $100 billion by 2020. The estimates that have come up for adaptation and mitigation and loss and damage, we're not even counting that yet. We are talking about trillions. So developing countries have asked for a long-term finance roadmap and goal. That is getting absolute resistance. Forget about any numbers, okay? We can't even meet the $100 billion, let alone a long-term goal. And many in fact, developing countries say we don't even want you to give us a big number. Just have a roadmap towards getting, more ambitious financing. Resistance, adaptation. This is a big ask from developing countries. We need a long-term goal on adaptation. There is a proposal on the table that's already in the text. Again, we see a lot of, we see resistance. Developed countries, in fact, want whatever comes out of Paris to be only about mitigation. We spent 2.5 years fighting over what should go into the INDCs, what should be the scope of the Paris outcome. And yet, if you look at the COP decisions that gave us the mandate to negotiate the 2015 agreement in Paris, it's all those 5 pillars: mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology, and capacity building. And we're still fighting on the way in the last few weeks going to Paris about that scope. So yes, the long-term goal should have a lot more, and also intergenerational equity. That has been something that a number of countries have put in the long-term goal section, to also recognize, for example, limited carbon space. Carbon budget has to be part of how we're going to calculate our long-term goals. So all these are facing tremendous resistance, if not total objection, from the developed countries. So except for mitigation, absolutely right, the question is spot on, we are still struggling with all the other pillars. So, like I said, Paris cannot be the end of the road. We have to say in Paris, these are all the unfinished business, and let's not close shop and just live for the next 20 years with INDCs, but we should really continue the work and to get back to honoring and implementing, as we have agreed for the last 10 years, the convention.
Great. There is a further question that's sort of, I guess it's maybe a good way to wrap up, unless there are other questions on content. But it's another person thanking you for your presentation and finding it very, very helpful, but also wondering, obviously for lots of people maybe hearing this for the first time, or even like myself for the nth time, we're still left with questions, and so someone is wondering how they can better inform themselves, and if they have follow-up questions, in what way they can ask. So not to answer on your behalf, but I would suggest to that person that you actually read the Third World Network updates and go on the website and check it out. I don't know if you have anything to add to that. I can suggest a few email lists and Twitter handles to follow.
I think that because this is the first of the series that that Earth in Brackets is organizing, in terms of the issues and the context and the discussion. I think that from the topics that I've seen that have been identified for discussion in the coming days, I think you're spot on in terms of highlighting what it is that we want to share information on. So once, as far as the World Network is concerned, once the meeting begins, we will be covering the negotiations, but that can be sometimes a little bit too detailed, kind of navel looking, unless you're really deep in the negotiations. So we have been discussing with some, for example, the media team, including yourself, right? Nathan, and others in the equity and ambition group, that we really need to step up our sort of more popular sort of messaging, not to be simplistic, but to also put some of the key fights and issues. So this is something that we will do a lot more during the Paris week. Somebody has just approached me to, I think Leah has asked me to sort of do a blog with some help from an intern. So I think we will do more than we have as the World Network compared to the previous COPs in terms of getting some of this more political assessment as the meeting goes. So we will share that with you, and any questions between now and Paris and during Paris, I'm happy to address. Just drop me an email or go through you, Nathan.
Okay. So yeah, that Yoke Ling made a good point. Someone is desperately trying to reach you.
I think it's my son.
Yeah. But to people watching on Google Hangouts, do remember that we have, this is only the first in a series of webinars helping us to prepare for COP, and so other speakers may answer some of your questions that are now currently brewing in your minds as you listen to Yoke Ling. The next one, I just want to for it, part 2 of this series, with Shivan Kartha, who is a IPCC author and also a senior scientist with the Stockholm Environment Institute, is going to present on fair shares, what Yoke Ling referred to as fair shares. So presenting on how do you fairly divide a global carbon budget, and why fairness. He'll go a lot more into the notion of equity and how to calculate it and quantify it, and why that's essential for Paris. So that webinar, called Playing Nice, is going to be on the 18th of November at 8 p.m. GMT, and so you can find us again. We will also circulate the link yet again to both the Youngo Facebook page and the mailing list. Would also help I would also appreciate your help in sort of diffusing that out through your own networks. I think there will be a number of informative listservs that will be set up in order to send out not just Third World Network updates and things like that, but also what Yoke Ling was referring to as sort of more popular kinds of materials, infographics, short blogs, sort of policy briefs, and that sort of thing. So you can just leave a comment or tweet at Earth in Brackets or tweet at myself or email one of us, or sort of join the next call to get our contact details if you're not already holding them, and we can certainly put you on those lists. I think I don't see any other questions on Google Hangouts, and I don't see any other questions on Twitter. So I think for now we're just going to take that as food for thought and go in and contemplate the many things, many ideas you've brought up for us, Yoke Ling. So again, just want to thank Sergio and Earth in Brackets for setting this up, making it all happen technically, and really sort of driving this initiative. And I also want to thank Yoke Ling for taking time out of what I'm sure is a fairly manic period in preparing for the COP to help us understand these issues a little bit better. And thanks to everyone for joining and for participating in this. And yeah, thanks for that. Sergio says that he is going to circulate an Earth in Brackets email account where if you don't have any of our individual emails and want to ask further questions, you can do so there. So you can put that on the Google Hangout. And yeah, just remember 8 p.m. GMT on the 18th of November, we will have Shivan Kartha. So looking forward to seeing you all there. And yeah, thank you, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks, Tiffany.